They laughed at the stove. By winter, they were knocking on my door.
The wagon moved like it was ashamed of itself. The wheels sank into the rutted mud of Milk River breaks Main Street, and every rotation cost the horses something they could not get back. People stopped what they were doing. A man carrying a flour sack set it down on the boardwalk and stared. Two women near the dry goods window leaned toward each other without taking their eyes off the road. A boy of about 10 climbed up onto a fence post for a better view. What they were looking at was a cast iron base burner stove. It weighed nearly 250 pounds, and it sat on the wagon bed like a judgment nobody had asked for. The wagon itself was old. The boards flexed visibly between the axles under the load. The horses leaned into their harness with their heads low and their breath coming in short white bursts. Driving the wagon was a woman named Verity Holt. She was 34 years old, and she did not look at the people watching her. She kept her eyes on the road ahead and her hands steady on the reins. Beside her sat a girl of 11 named Tilly. Behind Tilly in the wagon bed near the stove, a boy of 7 named Otis sat with his knees pulled up and his eyes moving from face to face along the street. Drummond Pryor was standing at the hitching rail in front of the freight office when the wagon passed. He was 48 years old, broad through the shoulders, and he had been hauling freight across every trail in the valley for 2 decades. He understood weight. He understood pace. He understood what a loaded wagon meant for Axel's horses and the wallet of whoever was paying for the trip. He looked at the stove, looked at the horses, and did the calculation in about 3 seconds. He stepped off the boardwalk and walked toward the wagon, not to help, to speak. He came up alongside the wheel and matched the wagon's slow pace for a few steps, his boots finding the ruts easily. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "Mrs. Holt, I have been hauling freight on every road in this valley for 20 years. I know what that stove weighs. I know what it costs to move. And I am telling you as a man who knows these things, that stove will eat more than it will ever heat." Verity did not look at him. She kept her eyes forward. Her hands did not change their position on the reins. Drummond walked alongside for another few steps, waiting for a response that did not come. Then he stopped and let the wagon go past him. From the wagon bed, Otis watched the man stop and fall behind. The boy turned to look at his mother's back, then at the faces still watching from the boardwalk. None of them were coming to help. None of them had moved toward the wagon at all. He leaned forward toward his sister. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Why won't they help?" Tilly did not answer. She was looking at the ground just past the wagon wheel. Verity heard the question. She kept her eyes on the road ahead for another few seconds. Then she spoke without turning. "Hold your brother's hand." The wagon kept moving. The stove kept moving. The laughter, when it came from somewhere behind her, stayed behind. Before she ever reached that street, before the wagon ever groaned under that weight, Verity Holt had already buried one future and started walking toward another. Her husband Caleb died in the spring of 1886. Pneumonia. It took him in 9 days, which was long enough for hope to become cruel, before it became silence. What he left behind was a rented house on the Dakota line, 2 children, a stack of bills that did not care about grief, and a landlord who wanted another season's payment before winter arrived. Verity did not have it. What she did have was a homestead claim Caleb had filed 3 months before he got sick. He had never seen the land in person. He had filed the paperwork on the description of a man who had passed through and said the soil near Milk River Breaks was worth trying. The cabin on the claim was unfinished. The nearest neighbor was far enough away to be useless in an emergency. The growing season was short and the winters were not. But if she could survive one winter on that land, the land would belong to Tilly and Otis someday. That possibility was worth more than the house she was leaving. The stove was the problem that everyone had an opinion about. It had belonged to Caleb's family for years before it came to them. His father had bought it after a winter that nearly killed the family. They had been using a sheet iron box stove, the kind most frontier families kept because it was cheap and light enough to move. It heated a room quickly and lost that heat just as quickly once the fire burned down. One night the fire died before dawn. Frost crept across the cabin floor. The children woke up to a room that was trying to kill them. That lesson did not leave the family. The cast iron base burner worked on a different principle entirely. Its walls were thick, nearly an inch through in places, and that thickness was the whole point. Cast iron, this heavy absorbed heat, slowly storing it deep in the metal itself, rather than letting it pass straight through. What it stored, it released with the same deliberateness, giving it back to the room over hours rather than minutes. A fire burning inside it pushed hot gases through a longer internal route before they escaped up the flue, which meant warmth stayed inside the stove longer and did more useful work in the room before it was lost. A fire well managed at 10 in the evening could still be heating a cabin at 4 in the morning without anyone waking to feed it. That was the entire argument for hauling 250 pounds across a muddy prairie. Caleb used to say it plainly: a stove that quits before dawn is just a lantern with a door. After he died, several people advised Verity to sell the stove. It was worth money. That money could buy flower boots for tilly cloth for repairs, salt pork to ease the first hard months. A neighbor woman said it kindly. The landlord mentioned it less kindly when she told him as she was leaving. Instead, Verity sold her last milk cow. She left her mother's rocking chair behind. Part of Caleb's tool chest stayed in Dakota because there was no room and no reason to carry everything. Some of the children's books were packed away and surrendered because weight was a budget and every pound had to justify itself. The stove stayed. At 3 in the morning, when winter reached its coldest hour, memories could not warm a cabin. 2 sleeping children needed something stronger than that. The morning she was supposed to leave, a horse and rider came up the road before she had finished loading. It was Oberon Holt, Caleb's father, 66 years old with a back bent from too many decades of hard work and a face that had stopped expecting the world to be fair sometime around 1850. He was not a cruel man. He had never been a cruel man, but he had lived long enough to know what killed people on the frontier, and in his experience, it was usually the decision that looked like hope. He dismounted and walked around the wagon without saying anything at first. He looked at the stove the way a man looks at something he already knows is going to cause trouble. Then he looked at Verity. That stove belonged to my son, and before him, it belonged to me. I know what it is. He paused. Sell it. Take the money and buy flour and salt. You have 2 children who need to eat in January, and a cast iron stove is not food. Verity kept her hands moving. She was securing a rope around a crate of cookware, and she did not stop. Oberon watched her for a moment. Then he said the thing he had clearly come to say. Come to Nebraska. Bring the children. You can work the kitchen, garden, help with the house. The children will have food and a roof and someone to look after them properly. You do not have to go to some unfinished cabin in Montana and try to survive the winter alone. Verity finished the knot on the rope. She straightened up and looked at her father-in-law. He was not wrong about any individual fact. The cabin was unfinished. The winter would be hard. She was going alone. All of that was true. She said, I am grateful for the offer, Oberon. Truly. She looked back at the wagon, but I am going to Milk River Breaks. He stood there a moment longer. When he spoke again, his voice had gone quieter, and somehow that was harder to hear than the argument had been. Margaret's rocking chair is worth more than that stove, and you left it. He looked at Tilly and Otis, who were standing near the horse and listening. He looked back at Verity. Winter will judge this decision. He mounted his horse and rode back down the road. Tilly watched him go. Then she turned to look at her mother, who was already back at the wagon checking the harness buckle on the left trace. Nobody spoke about it again, but the words stayed. Getting the stove to Milk River Breaks took longer than the wagon was built for. The bed flexed and sagged under the weight. On stretches of soft ground, the rear wheels sank 4 inches into the mud. The horses worked hard for every mile. Every 3 miles or so, Verity stopped to let them rest. She checked the harness. She checked the wheels. She checked the stove, making sure the rope had not shifted and the crate was not putting uneven pressure on the boards. A broken wagon would leave her stranded. A shifted load could kill a horse. Neither was affordable. When the road climbed the clay ridge, Tilly and Otis climbed down and walked so the horses did not have to carry their weight as well. Verity stayed beside the wagon with one hand on the side rail, watching how the loads settled across the rear axle at different angles. That afternoon, passing through the main street of Milk River Breaks, the wagon hit a patch of crusted mud and lurched to the right. Verity reacted before the wheel could sink deeper. She had a wooden wedge in her coat pocket, and she had it under the wheel in 4 seconds. A rawhide rope went around the stove crate while the wagon was still rocking. She told Tilly to keep Otis away from the wheels, and she finished the job. Drummond Pryor was there again. He was there along with 4 or 5 other men who had gathered at the hitching rail the way men did when something worth watching was happening. They watched her slide the wedge. They watched her tighten the rope. None of them moved. This time Drummond came closer than he had before. He stepped off the boardwalk and walked to within a few feet of the wagon while Verity was still on one knee in the mud, working the rope. He did not offer his hands. He offered his opinion. You are going to pull that axle clean off before you reach the claim. He said it without heat, the way a man states something obvious to someone who cannot see it. And when you do, you will have spent everything you have on a stove sitting in a ditch 3 miles from a cabin you cannot heat. Verity finished the rope. She stood up. She looked at Drummond Pryor directly for the first time since she had entered the valley. When she spoke, her voice was even. Thank you for your concern. She climbed back onto the wagon seat. Drummond stood where he was and watched the wagon move away from him. He could not have said exactly why the exchange left him feeling less certain than he had before it. From the wagon bed, Otis had watched the whole thing. He tugged at his sister's sleeve. Tilly was looking straight ahead the way their mother was looking straight ahead, and she did not turn her head. But she reached over and took her brother's hand without being asked. By the time the wagon reached the claim, the sun had dropped behind the western ridges, and the sky had gone the color of cold ash. The trip was over. The difficult part was not. No neighbor appeared on horseback. No wagon followed her home. The men who had watched in town had stayed in town. That left Verity with a problem weighing 250 pounds and no solution that did not require her to build one. Caleb had left tools. Not many, but the right ones. There was a block and tackle that had seen better decades but still held. There were 2 cottonwood skids, a length of rusted chain, and 3 wooden wedges worn smooth with use. Near the cabin stood 2 weathered posts that had been left by whoever abandoned the claim before Caleb filed for it. Verity lashed a crossbeam between the posts and hung the pulley overhead. Tilly held the lantern as the light faded. Otis had one job. Whenever Verity called out, he counted. The rhythm kept everyone moving at the same pace. The children lacked the strength to move the stove, but they could help keep the work orderly. Tilly understood this without being told. She held the lantern iron at the exact angle her mother needed adjusting it when the shadows fell wrong, never letting it waver, even when her arm got tired. Otis counted with the full seriousness of a boy who understood that his number was important, even if he did not fully understand why. The stove came down slowly. A few inches stop, a few inches more stop. The rope was fighting gravity directly, and at one point it slipped. The load shifted. One corner dropped suddenly. A board in the wagon bed groaned in a way that sounded like a warning. Verity jammed a wedge under the low side before the groan finished. She secured the chain. Then she studied the angle of the pull for nearly a full minute, not rushing, not reacting from panic. The rope was fighting gravity straight down, and that was the wrong fight. She rerouted it diagonally across the wagon bed. The resistance changed immediately. The stove settled. Control came back. By the time the stove reached the cottonwood skids, the skin across 3 of her knuckles had split open from the rope. The wagon was intact. The stove was intact. Tilly and Otis had never stepped inside the danger zone. That night, the stove sat outside the cabin door on the skids. In the lantern light, it looked almost like a living thing, patient and self-contained, waiting for permission to come inside. Verity sat on the cabin step and looked at it for a long time. The valley was dark in every direction. The nearest light was too far away to reach. She was tired in a way that went past her muscles and into something deeper. The kind of tired that comes from carrying something alone for so long that you have forgotten what it felt like before the weight was yours. She reached into her coat pocket and took out a folded piece of paper. It was the original claim document, the one Caleb had signed. She had carried it in her pocket since Dakota, through every mile of mud and every conversation she had not wanted to have. She read the name of the land in the dim lantern light. Then she folded it back up and held it against her palm. She thought about what Oberon had said, not with anger. She let the doubt sit there in the cold air and acknowledged it for what it was. She was 34 years old, alone on a claim she had never seen before today, with 2 children and a stove that was not yet inside, in a winter she could not bargain with. The doubt had every right to be there. She put the paper inside Caleb's tool chest, which she had carried into the cabin before dark. She closed the latch. Then she banked the small fire she had built in the cabin's old box stove, adjusted the vent, and went to sleep. The stove rested on the skids outside the cabin through the rest of the night, and when morning came, the frost had settled on it lightly, a thin coating across the flat-top surface that burned off within an hour of the sun clearing the ridge. Verity walked around it in the early light, the way Eben Marsh would walk around it later that same morning, not looking for anything specific, just looking. The iron had weathered well. The crack in the fire brick liner was real and would need attention, but the firebox walls themselves were solid. The base was level. The flue collar, though it would need reseating, was the original cast piece and not the cheaper stamped replacement that had come on newer stoves in recent years. She went inside and made a fire in the small box stove that had been left behind with the cabin, a battered sheet iron thing that heated fast and cooled just as fast, and she made coffee and thought about what needed to happen in what order. The cabin itself needed work before the big stove could be properly installed. Two of the chinking gaps in the north wall were wide enough to let in drafts that would undermine any stove she put in there. The floor near the northeast corner had one plank that moved when you stepped on it, which meant the foundation underneath had shifted. She needed to address both of those things before the stove went in, or the stove would be working against a building that could not hold what it was given. She spent that first full day on the cabin itself pressing clay mix into the chinking gaps, nailing the loose plank from underneath by lying flat on her back in the crawl space with Tilly holding the lantern through the floor hatch. Odue brought fresh clay from the creek bank in a bucket trip after trip without being asked twice. By late afternoon, both problems had been addressed, and the cabin was a better vessel for what she intended to put inside it. None of that work was visible from the road. None of it would be remarked on by anyone who came later, but it was the foundation on which everything else depended, and Verity had learned years ago that the work nobody noticed was usually the work that mattered most. There was a task that evening that Verity had been putting off because it required concentration she had not had available since arriving. The flue pipe needed to be run correctly before the big stove could be used. The cabin had a chimney. The previous occupant had built one of fieldstone and clay, but the pipe connection point was in the wrong wall for the stove's intended position. She would need to build a new connection through the north wall, which meant cutting through logs and fitting a thimble, which was a job that could go badly in several ways if the angles were not right. She worked it out on paper that evening by lantern light while Tilly and Otis slept. She drew the cabin from above and marked the stove position and the chimney position, and drew lines between them to find the route that would give the flue pipe the least horizontal run and the steepest rise she could manage. A flue that ran too flat would not draw well. A flue that had to negotiate too many offsets would create places where creosote collected. She had watched Caleb work through problems like this, and she had a good sense of what she was looking for even when she could not have explained all the engineering behind it. By the time she put the paper away, she had a plan she could work from. She would need to borrow a brace and bit from somewhere to make the wall penetration, and she would need a length of stovepipe that she had not yet acquired. Those things would require a trip back to town. She made a list and went to sleep. The stovepipe she needed turned out to require 2 trips into town rather than 1. The first time the section Sybil Breck had in stock was the wrong diameter, a common enough size for the lighter stoves, but not right for the base burner's collar. Sybil wrote the correct specification in her order book without comment and said it would come on the next freight wagon. The second trip 2 weeks later produced the right pipe and also a handful of collar screws that Eben Marsh had set aside for her without being asked, wrapped in a piece of cloth with a note that said, "Only use the middle holes first." She installed the flue pipe on a morning when the temperature had dropped enough to make the work uncomfortable, but not yet cold enough to make it dangerous. She worked from her drawing, cutting the wall penetration at the angle she had calculated, fitting the thimble, running the pipe in sections from the stove collar to the chimney connection. Tilly handed her things. Otis stayed outside and watched through the window and periodically reported on how the smoke was moving when Verity lit a test fire of paper and kindling to check the draw. The draw was good, better than she had calculated in fact, because the chimney was taller than she had measured it, which gave the flue a steeper rise and a stronger pull than her drawing had assumed. This was a gift from the previous occupant's overbuilding, and she accepted it. By evening of that day, the stove was fully installed, fully connected, and fully operational. She built the first real fire in it at dusk and sat with the children and watched the cast iron absorb the heat with the deliberate patience of something that had been built to last and knew it. The following morning brought Eben Marsh. He was the settlement's blacksmith, 52 years old, with hands that looked like they had been formed specifically for the work he did, and eyes that assessed metal and structure, and load the way other men assess crops and weather. He had heard about the enormous cast iron stove sitting outside the Holt woman's cabin, and curiosity had brought him out before his forge was fully heated. He tied his horse and walked around the stove without speaking for the first minute. His eyes moved from the flue collar to the base from the mica window, darkened with years of smoke, to the crack running through one of the fire brick liners inside the firebox. He crouched and ran his thumb along the crack. He straightened up and looked at the cabin wall, then at the plank floor just inside the open doorway. Big stove for a small cabin. Verity was unpacking supplies and did not stop. Eben crouched again beside the firebox and examined the collar more carefully. A base burner like this wants a steady draft. Give it the wrong flue height, a loose collar, a door seal that leaks, or put it in the wrong position relative to the wall, and it will never behave right. He tapped the cracked brick with one finger. Heavy iron does not forgive poor fitting. Verity set down the box she was holding. Do you have any old stove rope? He looked up at her. Got some scraps. Enough to use, maybe. He paused. Not pretty. Verity looked at the cabin wall where the stove would eventually sit. Pretty does not stop a draft. Height does. Eben stayed crouched for a long moment. He had spent his working life around people who talked about stoves as things to be bought and complained about. Verity had just talked about a stove as a system, as something with conditions and requirements that had to be met before it would do what was asked of it. That was a different way of thinking about it, and he recognized it immediately. He went to his saddlebag and came back with a worn coil of stove rope stained dark from previous use. He held it out and she took it. He still believed the stove might be too much for the cabin. He still believed several things could go wrong, but he had seen enough winters to know preparation when he was standing in front of it. I will come back when it is installed. Not because I think it will go well, because if something is wrong, better to find it before December. He mounted his horse and rode back toward the settlement. Verity watched him go, then looked at the stove, then went back to work. That afternoon, Reverend Caswell Stroud came down the road. He was 58 years old and the kind of man who had earned genuine trust over a long time, which gave his words more weight than most men's, and occasionally gave them more reach than he intended. He pulled his horse up near the cabin and dismounted carefully. He looked at the stove sitting on its skids, then at Verity. He spoke with the measured gentleness of someone delivering news they believe is necessary. Verity, I have heard you sold your milk cow to keep this stove. He paused. I am concerned about Tilly and Otis. There is a good family in the valley who would take the children through the winter while you establish the claim. The children would be warm and fed. It would only be for a season. Verity stopped what she was doing. She stood still with both hands at her sides and looked at Reverend Stroud. The offer was not simple to refuse. Stroud was not manufacturing danger. He was not trying to discourage her from the claim. He genuinely believed that 2 children in an unfinished Montana cabin, with a widow who had less wood than she needed, was a situation that could end badly, and he was probably not wrong to think it. The man standing in front of her had buried people who had made smaller mistakes than the ones she might be making. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, I appreciate your care for them, Reverend. I do. She kept her voice even and her eyes on his. I will see to their safety right here. Stroud held her gaze for a moment. He was not angry. He was sincerely unconvinced, which was harder to manage than anger, because it did not give her anything to push against. He nodded once with the careful courtesy of a man who intends to return to the subject, mounted his horse, and rode back toward town. Tilly had been standing near the woodpile the entire time. She had heard every word. After the Reverend's horse disappeared around the bend, she did not move for a moment. Then she picked up the bucket near her feet and went toward the creek to get water. She said nothing to her mother. She asked no questions. But the way she walked had something different in it, a quality she had not had that morning. Something that had to do with having heard a thing clearly and decided what it meant. Moving the stove into the cabin took 2 full days. Verity took the front door off its hinges to gain a few extra inches of clearance. She spread old sacking beneath the skids to reduce friction across the floor. Smooth river stones from the creek bottom became temporary bearing points, letting the stove roll forward a little at a time. She spent 10 minutes calculating each angle before every pull. The process never looked dramatic. It looked patient. Once the stove crossed the threshold, she guided it toward the northeast corner. That wall received less direct wind during most winter storms, which meant less cold air pressing through the gaps in the logs. She refused to place it directly against the wall. Instead, she built a backing from flat river stones, bonded with clay slip a barrier that would stand between the hot iron and the log wall through every long burn ahead. A proper hearth came next, flat stones fitted tightly above the plank floor, raised just enough so stray embers could not reach the gaps between boards. Tilly watched all of it. She watched where kindling would be stored and noticed where the larger wood would stack. She watched her mother place the stove step back, look at the angle relative to the wall, and move it 2 inches further before setting it permanently. The decisions came without explanations. They came with results that a person paying attention could observe. On the second evening, when the stove was finally in its place and the clay backing was beginning to dry, Otis put his hand against the cold iron. The metal felt lifeless. He looked up at his mother. "Will it stay warm all night?" Verity paused before answering. She looked from the stove to the stone, backing to the unfinished wood rack she planned to build along the near wall. "If we do our part." The answer carried more truth than Otis understood. The stove alone could not keep them alive. Neither could skill alone. The tool and the person using it, and the cabin surrounding them, and the weather pressing from outside all had to work together, and any one of them failing at the wrong moment would undo the rest. Otis nodded as though he understood and went back to his corner. Outside, the temperature had dropped since morning. Not dramatically, just the way warmth leaves a room when something changes in another part of the house. A difference you feel before you can name it. The horses stood with their hindquarters turned to the north that evening and did not move from that position until long after dark. Verity noticed. She did not mention it to the children. She went inside, added a piece of wood to the stove that was now burning its first real fire, and sat for a moment in the warmth beginning to come off the iron. The fire found its pace. The heavy metal absorbed what it was given without rushing. She took the claim document from the tool chest and looked at it one more time. Then she put it back, closed the latch, banked the coals the way Caleb had taught her, and went to bed. Through the cabin wall, almost too faint to hear, the wind was beginning to move in a way it had not moved that morning. The woodpile told the truth before anything else did. Verity stood in front of it on a gray morning in mid-October and counted what she had with the same care she gave to everything that mattered. 1 cord and 3/4. She walked the length of it twice and counted again. The number did not change. 1 cord and 3/4 was enough to feel hopeful on a mild afternoon. It was not enough to feel secure when January came. 2.5 cords would have been closer to right, perhaps more. The problem was that wanting a number and having it were two entirely different conversations, and only the second one mattered to Winter. The money was gone. The cow was gone. The decisions had already been made. What remained under her control was not the quantity of wood. It was what she did with what she had. She spent the better part of that morning sorting the pile with a deliberateness that would have looked strange to anyone watching. The dry cottonwood went closest to the cabin door. It caught fast and rebuilt a coal bed quickly when the fire needed waking before dawn. The heavier ash splits went into their own section near the back. Those pieces burned long and left coals that held through the coldest hours. Small kindling went into 2 wooden boxes near the stove, positioned so Tilly could reach them without standing on anything and without needing to hold the main firebox door open. Every second the firebox door stood open was heat leaving the room. In October, that was a minor inefficiency. In January, it was a calculation with consequences. Most settlers kept nearly all their fuel outside stacked against the cabin wall, where a bad night meant a cold walk to get it. Verity had decided weeks earlier she would not do this. She built a small wood bay inside the cabin beside the stove tucked against the wall. It took up room that a small cabin had no business giving away. It held enough fuel for more than a full day of continuous burning, which meant whatever happened outside, she would not need to open the exterior door to keep the fire alive. She was still stacking the indoor bay that afternoon when she heard a horse slow on the road. Drummond Pryor did not stop completely. He pulled his horse to a walk and looked through the open cabin door at the wood stacked inside. He considered it long enough to form a view which never took him long. He called out without dismounting, "Keep hauling wood inside like that, and the mice will own the place before Christmas." Verity continued stacking. She did not look up. Drummond sat on his horse for another moment, certain he had identified yet another mistake by a woman who seemed committed to making them. Then he rode on. Inside, Tilly had stopped what she was doing. She looked at the wood bay, then at the door where Drummond had been, then at her mother's back. The stack did look strange. There was something almost excessive about it, the way it changed the shape of the room and announced its presence the moment you came inside. But Tilly had been watching her mother for weeks now, and she had begun to see a pattern that she did not yet have the language to describe. Every decision that looked wrong to other people had a reason behind it that only became visible later. The stove that was too heavy, the northeast corner, the clay seal around the hearthstones. None of it looked necessary until it suddenly was. She went back to her work without speaking. What Drummond saw was wasted floor space and rodent trouble. What Tilly was beginning to understand, without quite being able to say, it was that her mother did not think about firewood the way other people did. Most people thought about how much they had. Her mother thought about whether she could reach it. Those were not always the same thing. The overnight test came at the end of October. Verity had been planning it for 2 weeks. The reasoning was straightforward. Winter had not arrived yet, and that was exactly why the test mattered. A problem found in October could be fixed with calm hands and good light. A problem found in January carried a different kind of cost. She had heard the stories that circulated through frontier settlements, the ones that started with "we thought we were prepared" and ended with spring burials. The first evening went the way she had hoped. She built the fire with care, starting small and letting it grow through dry cottonwood before adding the first heavy ash split around 7 in the evening. The cast iron warmed at its own deliberate pace. Heat spread through the room without the sharp swings a lighter stove produced. The stone backing against the northeast wall began taking in warmth and holding it. By the time Tilly and Otis went to sleep, the cabin was comfortable in a way that did not call attention to itself. It was simply not cold. Verity stayed up another hour watching the fire settle. She adjusted the damper once. Then she slept. Sometime around 3 in the morning, she opened her eyes. She lay still and listened. A sound had woken her. It was Otis shifting under his blanket. Nothing more. She closed her eyes, opening them again. The stove was still warm. The room still held heat. But something had changed and she could not place it. She got up. The lantern showed her a room that looked undisturbed. Fire where it should be. Stone backing warm to the touch. Floor near the center of the room holding heat. She crouched near the hearthstone and held the back of her hand close to the seam where the stone met the plank floor. A cold current moved across her knuckles. Barely there. The kind of thing a person in a hurry would walk past a dozen times. She followed it. The gap was at the seam where the hearthstone and the planking met, where the clay had not bonded fully to both surfaces during the installation. Near the flue collar, a faint line of soot marked a second place where air was moving in the wrong direction. Both gaps were small. Together they were enough to pull warmth away from the corner where the children slept. Eben had warned her. Heavy iron does not forgive poor fitting. She had believed him the way you believe a warning before you have seen what it describes. Now she had seen it. She was not discouraged. She had never expected the first attempt at anything to be finished. What was in front of her was not failure. It was a problem with a shape and a location, which meant it was a problem she could do something about. She went back to bed and lay there thinking through the repairs until first light. The following morning, she worked most of the day with a bucket of clay slip mixed with fine ash for better bonding and a patience that had nothing to prove to anyone watching. The hearthstone seam got filled and smoothed. Additional stove rope went around the firebox door where the old material had compressed unevenly. 3 flat stones near the rear of the stove were repositioned where heat had been escaping too fast. A piece of tin bent at an angle and placed behind the stove redirected a current of air and reflected warmth back toward the living space instead of losing it to the wall. None of it looked like much when it was done. A person walking through would have noticed almost nothing different. That was the nature of repairs that actually worked. The best ones disappeared into the system. Eben Marsh came back 4 days later. He had said he would, and he was a man who followed through on what he said. He tied his horse and came inside without ceremony, moving through the room slowly and looking at everything with the attention he normally reserved for structural metalwork. He found the hearthstone seam, the flue collar, the repositioned stones, the new rope at the firebox door. He found the tin sheet and studied the angle she had bent it to. Then he reached into his coat pocket and took out a length of white cotton thread. Verity watched without speaking as he tied one end to a nail near the hearth and let the other hang free. Several days earlier, a draft through that gap had been strong enough to move such a thread noticeably. Now it hung nearly still, a faint tremble at the bottom. That was all. Eben looked at it for a longer time than the measurement required. He walked around the stove once more, looking at the collar, the seam, the tin sheet. Then he straightened up and nodded once. That will hold better. Verity looked up from the wood she was sorting. Better than what? The question stayed in the air. Eben looked out through the window. The settlement was visible at a distance, a scatter of cabins and smoke, and the shapes of people going about their preparation. His own house was somewhere in that view. Inside it was the sheet iron stove he had used for years and never seen a reason to question. When he answered, his voice was quieter than the room required, better than most. Then he did something Verity had not expected. He pulled a stool close and sat down. He looked at the thread for a moment, then at her. How did you find the gap? How did you know to look there? It was not a test. The question came from someone who wanted to know. Verity set down the wood she was holding. I got up in the night because something felt wrong. I could not say what. I held my hand near the floor and followed the cold until I found where it was coming from. Eben was quiet for a moment. Most people would have decided it was cold because it was October. Verity looked at him. Most people would have been warm enough not to notice. He sat with that for a while. Then he stood up and put the stool back. He was still not ready to say the stove was the right choice. He was still not willing to say he would have made the same decision in her position. But the thread was still and the seam was tight, and the woman across the room had found a flaw in the dark using nothing but her hand and her attention. He rode back to the settlement and spent part of that evening looking at his own flu collar in a way he had not thought to look at it before. The valley continued to prepare for winter the way it always had, and the way it always had left a great deal to chance. Sybil Breck kept her ledger behind the counter at the general store. The orders through October looked like the orders from every October she could remember. Flour, salt, pork, lamp oil, axe handles, nails. The questions she did not hear were questions about stove rope or fire brick or whether a collar had worked loose over the summer. Eben had raised those subjects with customers over the years and received the particular kind of patience that people reserve for advice they have already decided not to follow. Drummond Pryor had a wood pile stacked nearly to the lower edge of his front window. Most of it sat fully exposed to whatever weather arrived. He looked at that pile and felt what a man feels when he has done what needed doing. He had enough. That was the whole calculation as far as he was concerned. The settlement felt ready. That was the particular danger of late autumn on the frontier. The visible work of preparation was done, and winter was still an idea rather than a fact, which meant what a man could see with his eyes felt more real than what he could not yet imagine. A large wood pile was visible. What ice could do to a large wood pile was not something any of them had needed to imagine before. In the second week of November, Tilly went to Sybil Breck's store to buy salt. It was a short trip, and she had made it before without anything happening. But this time, as she waited at the counter for Sybil to measure out the salt, she heard Drummond Pryor's voice from somewhere near the back, where a few men had gathered around the potbelly stove. He was telling the story of the wood stacked inside the Holt cabin. He was telling it in the way that made people laugh, and they were laughing, 2 or 3 of them, the easy laughter of people who find something funny because it confirms what they already believe. Tilly held the edge of the counter and listened. A few weeks earlier, that sound would have worked on her like a hand pushing down. She knew what it felt like to hear her mother being made into a story for other people to enjoy. She had been carrying that weight since the main street in September. This time she listened and felt something different move through her. She could not have put words to it exactly. It had something to do with the thread hanging still near the hearth. Something to do with watching her mother work in the dark until she found what was wrong. Something to do with understanding that the people laughing right now were laughing because they had not yet been asked to pay for what they did not know. They were not wrong yet. They were just early. She paid for the salt. She thanked Sybil Breck. She walked home. She did not tell her mother what she had heard, but she walked differently for the rest of that day. In the days that followed, Verity noticed that Tilly had begun doing something new. In the evenings after supper, she would sit near the stove and watch it the way she used to watch her mother watch it. Not with the casual attention of someone sitting near a warm thing, but with the focused attention of someone learning a language by listening to how it sounded before attempting to speak it. She watched the damper position. She watched the color of the flame through the mica glass when the firebox door was briefly open. She noted how the stone backing felt at different hours of the evening and seemed to be mapping in her 11-year-old understanding the relationship between what went in and what came back out and when. One evening, Verity came inside from checking the horses and found Tilly standing near the stove with her hand held at waist height, palm down, feeling the air above the top surface. Not touching it, just reading it. Tilly heard her mother come in and looked up, a little self-conscious. Verity did not say anything. She hung up her coat and went to start the evening meal. But after a moment, she said without turning, "What did you find?" Tilly thought about it. It is hotter on the left side than the right. Verity nodded. The flue passes through the left side on its way up. That side will always run a little warmer. Tilly looked back at the stove. Then she said, so if you put something on to keep warm, you put it on the right side where it will not get too hot. That is right. Tilly filed this away with everything else she was filing away. She did not ask another question that evening, but she came back the next evening and stood near the stove again, at the same time taking the temperature of the air above the surface, with her palm mapping the difference, checking whether it held. Otis watched his sister do this and decided to investigate the stove from a different angle entirely. He determined that if you lay on the floor near the hearthstone, you could feel the warmth coming up through the stone itself, and that this was a very satisfactory place to spend time in the evening. Verity led him. He was 7 years old and the hearthstone was warm, and the fire was banked, and there was no danger to him there. Sometimes the best thing a child could learn about a fire was simply that it was reliable. Something else changed in those weeks before the storm, something that Verity noticed but could not have named precisely. The cabin had begun to feel different from the cabin she had moved into in September. Not larger, not more comfortable in any obvious material sense, but more intentional. Every object in it was where it was for a reason that she knew, and the reason was connected to every other reason in a system that she understood end to end. The kindling boxes were positioned so either child could reach them from a seated position near the stove. The ash splits were stacked with the driest ones accessible first. The water bucket sat close enough to the stove to keep the water from freezing overnight, but far enough that it would not boil away. The claim document was inside the tool chest in the corner, which was the safest place in the cabin from both fire and damp. She had not set out to create this kind of order. It had emerged from the daily practice of tending the stove in the cabin, the way a good tool emerges from the repeated work of using and adjusting and using again. The system had grown out of her attention to what worked and what didn't, and now the cabin worked as a whole rather than as a collection of things that happened to occupy the same space. Tilly had begun to understand this, she could tell. Not the reasoning behind each individual decision, not yet, but the fact that the decisions were connected to each other, that the cabin was a design thing rather than an accidental one. This understanding had changed how Tilly moved through the space, how she replaced things where she had found them, how she noted when something was out of its correct position and put it back without being asked. Otis understood something different and equally true. He understood that the cabin was safe. Not safe in the way a locked door is safe, but safe in the way that certain people are safe to be around because they have thought through the things that need to be thought through, and they are paying attention to the ones that still require watching. He slept well every night. He had since the stove was installed. Rilla, the widow who worked the claim half a mile east, came by in the second week of November. She came without announcing herself the way people on the frontier often did when they wanted to see something without the thing being adjusted for their observation. She rode up, tied her horse, and walked around the outside of the cabin before knocking. Then she came in and stood near the stove for a moment without speaking. She was 38 years old and had been working her land alone for 4 years. She was not a woman who asked for things, and she was not a woman who offered things that had not been asked for. But she was a woman who understood, from her own experience, the particular situation of being a woman alone on a claim in winter, and she had been watching the Holt cabin from a distance with the specific attention of someone who was not watching out of curiosity. She looked at the stove. She looked at the stone backing. She looked at the wood bay. Then she looked at Verity. Does that actually hold its heat through the night? Verity said it does, if the fitting is right and you manage the fire correctly. Rilla looked at the stove for another moment. Then she looked at the flue collar in the seam at the hearthstone and the position of the stove relative to the wall. She was reading the installation the way a practical person reads a practical thing, not for aesthetics, but for function. She nodded once and went back to her horse and rode home. 3 days later, Verity saw her at Sybil Breck's store where Rilla was asking Sybil about stove rope. Sybil looked briefly at Verity when Rilla came in a glance that was not quite a smile, but carried something in its direction. Then she turned back to Rilla and began looking through what she had in stock. By late November, something had shifted in the valley. Most of the people living in it did not notice. There was no single sign. The change came in the accumulation of small things. Smoke from chimneys stopped rising and began drifting low across the ground, instead dissolving before it got anywhere. Frost appeared on fence wire before the sun had finished its afternoon work. White crystals formed on surfaces that had no reason to be cold yet. Verity noticed the stove before she noticed anything else. She had been burning the same amount of wood each evening for weeks and knew without measuring how the cabin felt at each hour of the night. On an evening in late November, she added her usual fuel and sat with the result. The stove was doing what it always did, but the cabin felt different. The warmth that usually settled in by 8 o'clock was taking longer. The walls were pulling heat away at a rate they had not shown a week earlier. Something outside had changed. She went to the door and opened it. The cold came in differently, not just colder. It came in with a quality she recognized and did not enjoy recognizing. It had the feeling of something that had already made up its mind. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she came back inside and said to Tilly, "Bring in 2 more armloads of ash splits." Tilly looked through the window. The sky was clear. The afternoon had not been anything remarkable. She did not say any of this. She picked up her coat and brought in the wood. Otis was near the door when Tilly made the second trip. He looked past her toward the horizon line. "Is a storm coming?" Verity was adjusting the damper. She answered without turning. "Something is making up its mind." Reverend Stroud came back before the storm did. He arrived on a gray afternoon with his horse moving carefully on roads that had begun to set hard. He was not alone. With him was a woman named Ardith Croft, whose husband Merrick ran one of the larger cattle operations in the valley, and whose house had 3 rooms and a stove in each of them. Ardith Croft was not unkind. She had brought a jar of preserved apples tucked inside of her coat, held against her body to keep it from freezing on the ride over. Stroud dismounted and came to the door with the manner of a man who had prepared what he was going to say and believed it. "Verity, I have spoken with the Crofts. They are willing to take Tilly and Otis through the winter. No cost to you. You keep the land, you work the claim, and the children are warm and fed until spring." He paused and his voice carried no triumph in it, only the weight of someone who thinks they are preventing harm. "I am asking you to consider this seriously." Ardith Croft stood slightly behind him, holding her jar of apples, her expression carefully neutral. Verity looked at Stroud. Then she looked at Ardith Croft, at the jar of apples held against her coat, at the horse that had carried them both out here on a cold afternoon because they genuinely believed they were doing a good thing. "I hear you, Reverend. I know you mean this well." She kept her voice level and her eyes on his. "If I send my children away every time there is danger, what do they learn from watching me do that?" Stroud opened his mouth. He did not find what he needed quickly enough. Ardith Croft looked at him. The look was brief and did not labor to make its point. Stroud nodded once and said he hoped she would reconsider if conditions changed. He mounted up. Ardith Croft put the jar of apples back inside her coat and followed him without speaking. Tilly had been on the other side of the cabin door the entire time. She had not moved. She had heard the Reverend's voice and the sound of horses, and she had stood perfectly still and listened to every word through the gap between the door and the frame. After the horses faded down the road, she stayed still for another moment. Then she pushed the door open and came outside. Her mother was already moving back toward the woodpile. Tilly watched her for a few seconds. Then she said, "I am going to get water from the creek." Verity turned and looked at her daughter. Something had changed in the way Tilly was standing. Her shoulders were level, her chin was up. The quality she had gained somewhere between September and this afternoon was fully visible now. "All right," Verity said. Tilly picked up the bucket and walked toward the creek. That night, Verity sat alone after the children slept. The fire was settled into its long burn, and the cabin was holding its temperature evenly. She did not reach for the claim document. She did not rehearse the arguments she had made to Oberon or Stroud or Drummond Pryor. She looked at the stove and let the quiet be what it was. Then she did something she had not allowed herself since Dakota. She asked herself honestly in the dark, with no one to hear it, whether she had made the right choice. Not right about the stove, not right about the technical decisions, the clay and the rope and the tin sheet in the northeast corner. Right about bringing her children here at all. Right about refusing the help that had been offered. Right about believing that what she was building was worth what it might cost if she was wrong. She sat with the question long enough to feel its full weight. She did not argue with it. She let it sit in the warm dark beside her. Then she got up and checked the damper. The coal bed was good. The draft was steady. Every right thing she knew how to do had been done. What she could not control, she could not control. That was the whole of it. She went to bed. Outside, something changed around midnight. The temperature dropped, not with the drama of a storm, but the way a room changes when someone leaves it quietly and without announcement. By 2 in the morning, frost was forming on the inside of the window glass in thin ferns. By 3, the sound from the roof had started, thin and sharp and precise like a needle touching the surface of a tin plate. Then another, then a third. Ice was beginning to fall. Not snow, not wind, something quieter and considerably more patient. Each drop touched the world and hardened where it landed. Fence wire began to disappear under a clear coating. The axe handle leaning against the woodshed began to disappear. The wagon tongue began to disappear. Every surface in the valley was slowly acquiring a shell of glass, and the temperature at which this was happening was 31 degrees below zero. And the wind was almost entirely absent, which meant there was no sound of danger, no obvious alarm, nothing to tell a person still asleep that the world outside had changed into something else entirely. There was only the steady small percussion from the roof building, layer by layer, writing its verdict on every surface in the dark. Verity lay still and listened. She had been awake since the sound began. She did not get up yet. She lay there taking stock of everything she had done to be ready for exactly this kind of night. The clay was set. The rope was tight. The indoor wood bay was full. The coal bed was strong. The ash splits were dry and the cottonwood was within reach. She had done what she could do. Across the valley and the houses of people who had watched her pass on the main street and found good reasons to stay on the boardwalk. Wood piles sat beneath an accumulating shell of ice, and the axes that would be needed to reach that wood were leaning against walls where the cold was already working on the handles, and sheet iron stoves were burning toward the moment when someone would have to go outside and learn what 3/8 of an inch of clear ice had done to everything they thought they owned. The drops kept falling. Layer by careful layer, the verdict was being written. The ice had its own grammar, and by morning the valley was fluent in nothing else. Verity was up before first light. She fed the fire with dry cottonwood, first letting the fast wood catch against the coal bed and rebuild the base before she added anything heavier. The coal bed had held through the coldest hours without her needing to tend it. She added 2 ash splits once the cottonwood was burning steady, adjusted the damper with small, careful movements, and stood listening to the fire find its rhythm. The cabin was not warm the way a summer afternoon is warm. It was something more practical than that. It was stable. The temperature had not swung during the night. Tilly climbed out of her blankets without pulling them over her head first. Otis rubbed his face and looked around the room and said quietly, more to himself than to anyone, "My face does not hurt." Outside, the world had become something else. 3/8 of an inch of clear ice covered every surface in the valley. The fence lines had disappeared. The wagon in the yard had become a sculpture in glass. The woodshed door had a seal of ice thick enough to hold it shut, which Verity discovered when she went to check the outdoor supply and had to use the heel of her boot against the base of the door before it would open. The temperature was 31 below zero. The wind had stayed away. That was the cruel part of it. A proper blizzard announced itself with noise and violence and gave you something to prepare against. This storm had arrived in silence and done its work in silence, and now sat on the valley without drama, waiting to see who had thought carefully enough about what they could not yet see coming. Verity went back inside, closed the door, and took stock. Indoor wood supply enough for more than a full day of burning without opening the exterior door. Coal bed established and strong. Flue drawing well, stone backing warm to the touch. Children intact. Fire patient. She put the cottonwood box within Tilly's reach and began the morning. On the other side of the valley, Drummond Pryor's morning was going differently. His sheet iron stove had been burning hard since before dawn, working through the indoor wood at the pace a fast stove always demanded. By mid-morning it was gone. He put on his coat and went to the door. The latch resisted him. Ice had worked into the gap between the door and the frame overnight, and the door required real force before it came free. When it opened, the cold came in with a sharpness that stopped his breath, and the warmth he had spent the morning building went out past him into the frozen air. The woodpile stood exactly where he had left it. Everything looked right, except that the storm had changed the nature of everything. A layer of ice had bound the individual pieces together so completely that the stack had become a single solid object. He could see the wood. He could put his hands on the wood. He could not separate it. He got the axe. The first swing bounced back with a shock that ran to both elbows. He swung again, harder, angling to find a seam between pieces. He worked at it. He was not a man who gave up easily, and for a few minutes the fact of his effort produced results a fragment here, a piece there. Then on a swing that was slightly off angle, he felt something wrong in the handle before he heard it. A give in the motion that should not have been there. He looked at the handle and saw the split running along the grain. By early afternoon, the sheet iron stove held nothing but cold gray ash. He stood at his window. One chimney on the far side of the valley was still producing smoke. It was a steady ribbon even, and unhurried, the kind that came from a fire that had been correctly tended and did not need to roar in order to do its job. He had been looking at that chimney from this window for weeks without thinking much about it. He stood there now and thought about it differently. Less than 70 yards separated his cabin from the whole place. He put on both coats. The first step off the porch told him what the rest of the distance was going to cost. The ice was not snow. Snow gave a boot something to grip. This surface offered nothing in any direction. He moved carefully down the steps and made it to the yard, and then his right boot went out from under him and he came down hard on one knee. He got up. He moved more carefully. 15 yards from his cabin, his left boot slid entirely, and he came down on both hands and one knee and stayed there for a moment with the cold Pacific against his palms. He got back up. He made the rest of the crossing without dignity. Short steps, both arms out, using a buried fence post as an anchor at one point. Going to his knees twice more, and using the time down there to reassess rather than just trying to stand faster. By the time the whole cabin came into view, his scarf had ice along the edge where his breath had been hitting it, and his hands had gone past cold into something that felt more like absence. Inside the cabin, Tilly heard the knock first. It was soft, uncertain. She looked toward the door, then at her mother. Verity was already moving. She had noticed an hour earlier that the smoke above Drummond Pryor's chimney had stopped. She had registered it the way she registered everything that might become relevant, later filed it away and gone on with what she was doing. When the knock came, she was not surprised. She opened the door. Drummond Pryor stood on the small porch with ice along his scarf and his hands held slightly away from his sides in the way hands hold themselves when they have stopped obeying properly. The cold was on him visibly, but there was something else on him too, something that sat in his expression and the particular way he was not quite meeting her eyes. He was a man who had been certain about freight and wrong about fire, and he was standing on the porch of the woman he had told twice that she was making a mistake. And there was no arrangement of this moment that let him be anything other than exactly what he was. Behind him, further out across the ice, other shapes were moving toward the cabin. Rilla, the widow who worked the claim half a mile east, was picking her way across the ice with a deliberateness that looked like she had been thinking about this trip for the past hour and had decided to make it. Merrick and Florrie Croft were coming together, Florrie holding the youngest child pressed against her chest, Merrick pulling two others on a feed sack that moved across the glass surface more smoothly than boots could. None of them spoke to each other as they converged. None of them tried to explain themselves. The storm had stripped everything down to what mattered, and what mattered was the smoke still rising from the northeast corner of the Holt cabin. Verity opened the door wider. Warm air moved out onto the porch and reached them all at once. "Come in before the floor takes your feet." They came in one at a time. The cabin was not large. It had one room and a low ceiling and a plank floor in a northeast corner where a cast iron stove sat with its coal bed still going, and its stone backing still holding the warmth it had been collecting since the previous night, and its rope still seated tight against the firebox door where she had pressed it in October. The wood bay along the wall still had enough fuel to last through tomorrow. Nothing in the room looked accidental. Drummond Pryor sat down on the stool near the stove and pulled off his gloves. His fingertips were white. He held his hands near the warmth and let the heat find them at its own pace. He looked at the firebox without speaking. The coal bed glowed steadily in the dimness behind the glass, doing what it had been doing since before dawn, unhurried and entirely indifferent to whether anyone had believed in it. He had a thought about what his own stove looked like at this moment, and he set it aside. Florrie Croft stood in the middle of the room and rocked the youngest child against her chest, her eyes closed, just rocking. Merrick settled the other two in the corner with the blanket they had carried. The youngest was coughing, a wet sound that filled the cabin when it came. Florrie did not stop rocking. Rilla came in last and stood near the door a moment, looking at the room. Then she walked to the table and set down a jar of chokeberry preserve she had been carrying, pressed against her coat. She did not explain why she had brought it. Nobody asked. She found a place near the wall and sat down and was quiet for a long time. Tilly moved through the room with a quietness that was not the quietness of a child trying to stay out of the way. It was the quietness of someone doing a specific thing. She kept the cottonwood box supplied. She brought a cup of water to Florrie Croft without being asked. When Otis began to get restless, she took him to the corner near the wood bay and showed him how to sort the kindling by size, giving him a task with a purpose. Verity watched this without commenting. She tended the fire and let her daughter work. The afternoon passed in shifts of talk and silence. The fire required attention at intervals that were long enough to allow rest between them. Verity added fuel at the time she had learned it wanted fuel, adjusted the damper by small degrees, listening to sounds the stove made, the way a person listens to a familiar voice for what lies underneath the words. Toward evening, Eben Marsh arrived. He had spent the daylight hours helping a family on the north end of the settlement break through a frozen woodpile. His hands were stiff from that work, and his coat had ice along the lower hem from a fall on the road. He came inside and stood near the door and looked at the room, at the people in it, at the stove in the corner. Then he looked at the cotton thread still tied to the nail near the hearthstone. It was almost perfectly still. He walked over and looked at it closely. The flue collar showed no fresh soot. The hearthstone seam was tight and dry. The tin sheet was exactly where she had positioned it in October. He stood there longer than the inspection required. He was not looking at the thread anymore. He was looking at everything the thread represented, the weeks of small decisions and nighttime corrections and unglamorous adjustments that had led to this particular outcome, which was 11 people warm in one room while the valley paid for what it had not thought to do. He did not say anything about it. He found a place to sit. Later, after the children had been asleep for a while and the room had settled into the quiet that follows fear when warmth replaces it, Drummond Pryor stood up from his stool. He looked at the stove first, then at the wood bay, then at the door behind which the cold was waiting. When he finally looked at Verity, he kept his voice low enough not to disturb the sleeping children. "I told you that stove would eat more than it heated." He said it plainly. "I said it twice." He paused. "I was wrong." The room was quiet enough that everyone heard it and no one felt compelled to respond. Then he said, "I want to understand how you knew. Not the stove, how you prepared for something you could not see yet." Verity thought about the question the way it deserved to be thought about. "I did not know what was coming. I just prepared for what I could not predict." Drummond sat with that for a long moment. Then he nodded once slowly, the way a man nods when he is setting something down rather than picking something up. Near midnight, there was another knock at the door. Reverend Caswell Stroud stood in the doorway without his usual manner of careful presentation. No Bible, no companion. He was carrying 2 cornbread Johnny cakes wrapped in a cloth held out slightly in front of him, as though he understood they were not sufficient for whatever this moment required, but he had brought them anyway. Verity stepped back and let him in. Stroud stood inside the door and looked at the room. Drummond Pryor on the stool, the Croft family in the corner, the youngest child finally asleep against Florrie's shoulder. Rilla at the wall with her jar of preserves on the table beside the lantern. And Tilly, who had woken up when the door opened and was watching him from her blanket with the expression of someone who has learned to observe carefully before deciding what to feel. He set the Johnny cakes on the table next to the preserves. Then he turned to Verity and spoke quietly, meant mostly for her. "I came to your door twice this fall to tell you that you needed to change your decision." He looked at the stove in the corner, then back at her. "I am here tonight because your decision is keeping 10 people alive." He was quiet for a moment. "I was not wrong to worry about your children. I was wrong about what they needed in order to be safe." He did not ask for a response. He found a corner and sat down in it. Tilly lay back on her blanket and stared at the ceiling. She was in the place between sleep and wakefulness, where things sometimes become clear in a way they are not when you are fully in either state. She thought about the main street in September and Otis asking why nobody helped. She thought about watching her mother work by lamplight at the hearthstone seam while the valley slept. She thought about the salt she had bought from Sybil Breck, while Drummond Pryor told the story of the indoor woodpile to men who laughed at it. She thought about what it meant that those men were now asleep in the cabin the indoor woodpile had kept alive. She did not think in words. She thought the way you think when something is finding its permanent place inside you. She fell asleep. Verity tended the fire at 3 in the morning the way she always did, adding 2 heavy ash splits and adjusting the damper for the long hours before dawn. The cabin was full of the breathing of sleeping people. The stove made a small sound as the new wood caught. She stood in the warmth for a moment with one hand near the firebox, not checking anything, just standing there. She thought about Oberon, about Winter will judge this decision. She thought that he would have a different opinion about the judgment now, and she hoped he would, and then she let that hope be what it was without trying to do anything more with it. She went back to bed. The storm held for another 12 hours. Then it began to release the valley the way a fist releases something it has been holding too tightly, slowly and with reluctance. The first sound was a faint crack from somewhere down the fence line as the ice shifted under its own weight. Then a cottonwood branch let go of part of its burden, and the ice came down in pieces that broke further when they hit the frozen ground. By afternoon, the temperature had climbed enough to start the slow work of undoing what the night had built. Water began moving again, first as the faintest drip from the roof edge, then in a thin, uneven stream that stopped and started as the ice released in sections. By evening, families were making their way back to their own claims. They crossed the same ground they had crossed to get here, which now had enough texture in the ice that walking was merely difficult rather than impossible. The Croft children were bundled back up, and Merrick lifted the smaller two rather than risk them on the still, slick ground. Florrie Croft paused at the door, looked at Verity, and said simply, "Thank you," and left before anything more was required of the moment. Rilla was one of the last to go. She stood at the door with her coat buttoned and looked back at the stove. She looked at it for a long time the way Eben had looked at the thread, as though she was committing something specific to memory. Then she looked at Verity. "When spring comes," she said, "I am going to need to know about the fitting." Verity nodded. "Come when the mud dries." Rilla left. Drummond Pryor went last. He stood at the door with his gloves on and looked back at the cabin, once at the stove in the corner at the wood bay, with enough fuel still in it for half a day more. He looked at Verity. "I owe you more than I know how to say. You do not owe me anything." He thought about that for a moment. Then he nodded and went out into the cold. The night settled into something that was not quite ordinary sleep and not quite wakefulness. People shifted between the two, the way people do when they are warm for the first time in hours and their bodies are still not entirely certain the warmth will last. The children slept more deeply than the adults. Florrie Croft had finally sat down against the wall with the youngest child across her lap, still rocking slightly. Even in sleep, the motion becomes something involuntary. Merrick Croft sat near the door with his arms across his knees and his eyes closed, but his jaw still set the jaw of a man whose body had not yet received permission to relax. Rilla sat entirely still, with her eyes open, looking at the jar of chokeberry preserves on the table. She had carried that jar for 3/4 of a mile across glass ice because it had seemed standing in her cabin at the moment she decided to come like the right thing to bring. She was not entirely sure why she had thought so. It was not food for an emergency. It was the kind of thing you brought to a neighbor's house for reasons that had nothing to do with hunger. Maybe that was exactly why she had brought it, because what she was coming to was not an emergency anymore. It was a place where people were going to be all right. Verity moved through the cabin quietly at intervals, the small, purposeful movements of a person who knows every inch of a space and can navigate it without disturbing anything. She added wood when the stove called for it. She moved a child's blanket that had slipped. She set a cup of water on the table near where Eben Marsh was sitting with his stiff hands wrapped around it. Eben had been watching her work since he arrived. He had been watching the way she moved through the cabin, the economy of it, the absence of any wasted motion. He had been in and out of dozens of frontier homes over the decades of his work, homes of people who were good at what they did, and homes of people who were struggling. And he had developed a sense over those decades for the difference between a person who was managing their situation and a person whose situation was managing them. What he was watching in this cabin was something else, something he did not have a ready word for. It was a person who had built the situation and was now inhabiting it exactly as intended. He thought about the conversation he had had with Verity in October, when she had told him she got up in the night and followed the cold until she found it. He thought about the way she had answered him without pride and without false modesty, as a simple statement of what she had done and how. He thought about the thread hanging still on its nail and what it had taken to get it there. He had been a blacksmith for 30 years, and he understood something about the difference between doing a thing correctly and understanding why it was correct. Most people who use fire used it without understanding it. They fed it, and it burned, and they were warm. Verity Holt used fire the way a good blacksmith used metal. with an understanding of its properties and limits and requirements, a working knowledge built from paying attention to what the material told her, rather than what she assumed it would do. He did not say any of this. It was the middle of the night in a cabin full of people trying to sleep, and there was nothing useful to say that the evening had not already demonstrated more clearly than words could have. He drank the water and closed his eyes and let the stove do its work. In the years that followed, Verity thought occasionally about what the winter had cost the valley and what it had given it. The cost was plain enough. Some animals lost wood supplies, exhausted a week of hardship that nobody enjoyed remembering. The giving was harder to see because it had not arrived as an event, but as a gradual shift in how people went about their preparation in the seasons that followed. She noticed it in small things. Drummond Pryor the following autumn stacked a portion of his wood inside his lean-to under a roof. He did not make any announcement about this change. He simply did it. When Verity saw it, she understood that he had thought about the previous winter and made a decision, and that was the whole of the story. There was no acknowledgement between them. None was needed. Merrick Croft asked Eben Marsh to inspect his stove installation in September of the year following the storm. Eben found two things that needed correcting. He corrected them. Merrick paid him. The transaction took less than an hour and prevented exactly the kind of problem that had sent Merrick across the ice to the Holt cabin the previous December. Sybil Breck, who kept the ledger at the general store and therefore had a view of the valley's habits that no one else quite had told Verity the following spring that she had ordered twice as much stove rope as she had carried the year before and had already sold most of it. She said this without drama, the way a person reports a fact they find interesting rather than one they find significant. Verity thanked her and bought her usual supply and went back to the claim. The valley did not become a different kind of place. The people in it did not transform themselves into people who were thoughtful about preparation in ways they had not been before. What happened was smaller and more durable than transformation. A few of them learned one specific thing that they had not known before, and they carried that specific thing forward into the winters that followed. And over time, the winters in that valley cost the people in it a little less than they had cost before. That was how it worked. That was usually how it worked. What she knew was this: every person who came through that door in the night of the ice storm had watched her pass on the main street in September. Every one of them had made a choice that day, whether to help or to wait or to laugh or to say nothing. And every one of them had arrived at her door because the choice they had made in September had been answered by a different choice hers made in the weeks and months between then and December. One small decision at a time in the dark, with no one watching. 2 mornings after the storm, Verity stepped outside before first light for the same reason she went outside most mornings: to check the temperature, read the sky, think through what the day needed from her. She came around the corner of the cabin and stopped. 2 full cords of split ash wood had been stacked beside the lean-to. The cuts were clean and even. The stack was tight and well built, the kind of stack that takes time and thought and someone who knows what they are doing. There was no note. There was no signature. There was no indication of who had done it, except for the sledge runner marks in the snow, which told her it had come on a sled, which told her it had not come from one person making quiet trips in the night. It had been organized. More than one person had been involved. She stood there in the cold and looked at the wood for a long time. The sky was beginning to lighten at the edges, and the dark wood was visible against the snow, and there were 2 full cords of it, more than she needed to finish the winter, which meant that whoever had brought it had been thinking not just about the crisis, but about the season ahead. She did not spend time trying to determine who exactly had done it. The runner marks led back toward the settlement, and that was sufficient. She stood there until the cold began working on her hands, and then she went inside and started the morning fire. Spring came the way spring always came in that valley, slowly, and with setbacks, warm days interrupted by cold nights that reminded you the cold was not entirely done. The creek ran high with snowmelt. The mud arrived and then gradually dried. The prairie color changed in stages, the gray of early thaw giving way to the true green of the growing season. Sybil Breck's ledger changed with the spring orders. Stove rope 3 separate orders within 1 week. Fire brick 2 orders from people who had never asked about fire brick before. Flue collars 4. A question from Merrick Croft about base burners and where to obtain them and what to look for. A question from a man Sybil would not have expected to ask such a thing, wanting to know about the practical differences between ash and cottonwood for a long overnight burn. Eben Marsh changed his practice without announcing that he had done so. He began looking at flue connections before people complained about them, which had not been his habit before. He found problems in 2 chimneys that spring that would have caused serious trouble the following winter. He fixed both of them without making anything of it. The change in his approach was something he simply did. Rilla came when the mud dried, as she had said she would. She spent an afternoon at the Holt cabin, asking questions and listening carefully to the answers. She spent the following week working on her own installation and then asked Eben to come and look at it. He found the hearthstone seams sealed correctly, the collar seated properly, the rope packed around the firebox door with care. He told her it was good work. She thanked him without excess and went back to what she was doing. The settlement did not hold any kind of gathering about what had happened. It did not make any formal acknowledgement. Frontier communities were not built around public reckonings. What it did was change in the small daily ways that communities change when the evidence has been plain enough and the cost of ignoring it has been felt in a winter that nobody wanted to talk about directly. Verity Holt stayed on the claim. That summer, she extended the indoor wood bay along the wall to hold more fuel than before. She added more riverstone to the backing behind the stove, building the thermal mass higher. The northeast corner of the cabin, chosen in October with deliberate care, became over the following years the most reliable place in the valley for the kind of warmth that did not announce itself but simply continued. Tilly learned the fire the way she learned everything that year, by doing it alongside her mother and watching the results and adjusting. She learned to build a coal bed that held through the night without needing attention. She learned to read the color of coals and hear the difference between a draft that was working and one that was laboring. She learned when to add the heavy, slow wood and when the lighter, fast wood was enough. These were not lessons Verity taught by sitting her daughter down and explaining things. They were things Tilly learned by being present during the years when the knowledge was being used. Otis learned differently the way younger children absorb things before they have words for them. He learned the particular smell of ash splits catching in cold air. He learned the sound the stove made at 3 in the morning, when his mother added fuel, a sound that became over the years the sound of safety itself, the sound that meant someone was awake and managing the cold. Years later, grown and living in his own cabin in a different part of the territory, he would sometimes wake in the night for no reason he could name and lie still listening for a sound that was not there. It took him a long time to understand what he was listening for. The cast iron stove stayed in the northeast corner of the cabin for 19 years. It outlasted several of the sheet iron stoves in the settlement, which surprised no one who had come to understand the difference. It outlasted the original clay in the stone backing, which Verity rebuilt once when a dry summer caused it to crack. It outlasted the original flue collar and 2 full sets of fire brick and more coils of stove rope than anyone counted. What it did not outlast was the cabin itself, which Verity eventually replaced with a larger structure when Tilly was grown and Otis had left for his own land. When the new cabin was being built, she had the stove moved to the new northeast corner before the interior walls were framed, so the room could be built around the stove, rather than the stove fitted afterward into a space that was not designed for it. Eben Marsh helped with the installation himself, an older man by then, who moved more deliberately, but brought the same trained eyes to metal and function, in the places where preparation and neglect produced different outcomes. When Tilly married and left the claim, Verity gave her a coil of fresh stove rope and one piece of advice. Not every house needs a big stove. Every house needs to know where the wind is going. Tilly kept both things for the rest of her life, the rope and the words. Otis built his own cabin on land with shorter summers and colder winters than the valley where he grew up. He chose a smaller stove than the one his mother had hauled across the prairie, which was the right choice for the space and the elevation and the kind of cold his land produced. But he built the hearth before he finished the floor. He built the indoor wood bay before he built the kitchen shelves. He had the flue collar inspected before he lit the first fire. He did these things without deciding to do them the way a person does things that have become part of how they understand the world to work. The frontier taught most people who came to it how to build a fire. What it taught them was how to survive a night. Verity Holt had learned something that went further than that, or perhaps she had arrived already knowing it, and the winter had simply confirmed what she had understood since the morning she chose a 250-pound stove over a rocking chair and a milk cow. Heat is not something a stove makes. Heat is something a house learns to keep. It is something a careful person learns to protect through decisions made before the moment when those decisions matter. It does not call attention to itself when it is working. It becomes visible only when it is gone. Long before the ice storm arrived, she had made a choice that looked wrong to nearly everyone who witnessed it. She had dragged that choice through mud and through narrow doorways and into the unfinished corner of a cabin on land she had never seen until the day she arrived. She had sealed its gaps by lamplight and learned its behavior through a night of careful listening and corrected what she found without waiting for someone else to tell her it needed correcting. She had fed it through the coldest hours of a winter that asked every family in the valley to account for what they had not done. The fire she built in it that December morning before the valley woke up to discover what the ice had made of everything was still burning when 11 people came in from the cold. It was burning when they left. It burned for 19 years after that,